Welcome to the News Roundup for Tuesday, December 30th, 2025. I'm Bill Thomas. Almost a brand new year, and here's what's happening right now. Investigators zeroing in on Ilhan Omar as the Congresswoman's murky financial disclosures continue to raise eyebrows nationwide. Top allies of Governor Tim Walz now directly linked to a number of Minnesota state agencies responsible for doling out millions of taxpayer dollars to fraudulent Somali daycare schemes. And a congressional lawmaker pointing to a new audit and claiming that California is now the true fraud capital of America, adding that what's going on in Minnesota actually pales by comparison. Also, a new federal report revealing more mismanagement by the former Biden administration, this time involving housing payments made to tens of thousands of dead people. And a former child star who retired comfortably at the age of 14 announces a new set of rules for anyone who dares to approach him in public. All this and much more coming up right now on the Big Roundup. We have a great deal to get to today, and we begin right here. Representative Ilhan Omar is backpedaling furiously and playing a desperate game of defense as a growing number of federal officials are now actively investigating and questioning her sudden, unexpected burst of wealth. Now, how'd that happen? On her most recent congressional financial disclosure forms, Omar brags that both she and her husband are now worth up to, get this, $30 million, and perhaps even more remarkably, their skyrocketing fortunes seemingly popped up virtually overnight. Yeah, it's a miracle. Now, the Somalia-born lawmaker claims she's not worth nearly that much, and furthermore, she's accusing her critics of distorting the facts, twisting the narrative, and completely misrepresenting what she herself put down on those forms. At one point, she even sinks so low as to accuse her opponents of being unable to read. Well, they're reading just fine. What they're doing is reading between the lines. You know, when you take a closer look at those records, however, they begin to appear even more suspicious. For example, Omar brushes off her critics entirely by explaining that the family businesses she lists on her congressional forms, they're actually partnerships involving other people. In reality, her husband's wine company only has one other partner, and he just happens to be a former high-ranking official who worked directly with the Democratic Party. Although that's merely a coincidence. Yeah, you want more? Try this one on for size. Omar is now claiming that the values she put down on those forms simply reflect the total net worth of her husband's companies and have nothing to do at all with his share of those totals. You know, in the 1970s, I think they called this the new math, and it didn't make any sense back then either. In the meantime, in just 1 year, Omar claims that her husband's winery miraculously grew from a $50,000 a year business to one that's now worth nearly $5 million, despite having no apparent sales, no viable website. I looked around, couldn't find it, and despite legal accusations from a former investor who claims the organization lied outright by calling itself a legitimate company. And maybe the owner of the winery was simply sampling too much of his own product. You know, adding even more fuel to the fire, Omar still refuses to adhere to congressional protocol and disclose her husband's exact stakes in both the winery and his mysterious venture capital firm, which apparently does nothing and has no income at all, but which she claims went from being just about worthless to having a net value of nearly $25 million, and all in just 1 year, which means this guy, he's some kind of genius. Critics say that by not reporting the precise value of her husband's shares, Omar is effectively taking intentional efforts to hide the extent of her true wealth from the American people. There's nowhere to run. There's nowhere to hide. We figured it out. In the meantime, the Congresswoman is still apparently saddled with tens of thousands of dollars in student loan and credit card debt. And as we've mentioned repeatedly right here on this program, she's still very much under the microscope for her extremely close relationship to the massive Somali-linked welfare fraud scandal, which is plaguing her home state. We call that one the state of confusion. Final thought now, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown. And here we go again. I thought I explained this away yesterday and right here on this program, but apparently Ilhan Omar is oddly somehow back in the news again. Never saw that coming. Let me just say this. You know, in the old days, there was something in America called a rags to riches story, and we were proud of those who made it and made it big. Andrew Carnegie, Oprah Winfrey, Jeff Bezos, and more. And now a perfectly innocent congresswoman who always vilifies wealthy people, but I won't mention that, is yet another hardworking, honest soul who has come into some big dough. A couple of years ago, Omar and Hubby Cake's number 3 had a reported net worth of about $158,000. And maybe they put that money into one of those fancy Wells Fargo CDs, which I think pays about 3%. Like, I'm no math whiz, but you leave that money alone, and in a couple of years, interest and compounded interest and all that juicy stuff, I can see how quickly $158,000 could grow to $30 million. By the way, I'm only breaking this down for you to prove once and for all that she's on the up and up. And if you missed it yesterday, simply buy her new book to learn more about getting rich. And real quick, and there it is, how to snag $30 million almost overnight on a government employee salary for dummies. And so this thing, as you might imagine, literally flying off the bookshelves. People have left comments for us right here on the program saying they can't find it anywhere. Yeah, I get it. I hope this finally clears up any confusion with regard to this very pressing issue. And by the way, I apologize in advance for any interruptions during today's program, but as you know, at any moment, Madam Omar, she may be calling in on this boy right here, the hotline, to thank me for defending her. And if she does, so I will be taking that very important call. Turning now to shocking new revelations concerning the ongoing failure of struggling Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and his inability to get a handle on the growing welfare fraud scandal, which is now threatening to topple his entire administration. Like John Mellencamp said, the walls are going to start crumbling down. As can be expected, Walz is now facing extraordinary pressure following the recent release of a video showing a number of potentially fraudulent childcare centers, which are allegedly skimming millions of dollars under his watch. And according to new reports, he's got no one to blame but himself, although he'll keep passing the buck. If it turns out that several of Walz's closest political allies were directly in charge of the state agencies which were responsible for overseeing the state's federally funded child care assistance program and making things worse, like Walz, they too ignored all the warning signs. Adding insult to injury, the individuals Walz appointed to head up those agencies were apparently more focused on expanding diversity, equity, and inclusion. Good old DEI initiatives, rather than concentrating on the matter at hand. Or furthermore, right in front of their faces. Do your jobs, man. According to official records, many of the questionable daycare centers under their auspices were owned and operated by Somali immigrants, and even though they reportedly had a number of safety violations, the Walz administration was apparently too busy to revoke their operating licenses, thus allowing the alleged fraud to go on and right under their noses. Additionally, another high-ranking Walz appointee used her top position at the Department of Human Services to help a number of freshly arrived Somali immigrants find housing, jobs, and resources, and all while the agency under her watch was forking over millions of dollars to suspected Somali fraudsters who, they were bilking the system and all behind her back. All she had to do was take that blindfold off. In the meantime, critics continue to place the blame squarely on the shoulders of Governor Walz, who they say repeatedly turned a blind eye to constant warnings that enormous fraud was taking place in his state's daycare system. Additionally, many Republican lawmakers say the problem has gone on for far too long now, and they're calling for Walz to resign for the good of the people and finally call an end to his run as state's governor. And soon maybe they'll have one of those go-away parties for the Timmer. Not a going-away party, but what we call a go-away party. Run along. Now, for their part, a number of individuals involved with questionable daycare centers are all denying the recent allegations of fraud made against them. And they say the recent viral video claiming otherwise, it was made outside of their normal business hours and that there's no fraud going on whatsoever. Sounds entirely plausible to me. As can be expected, the Walz administration now backing up those claims, and they say they've already checked out all the sites, that they didn't find any fraud taking place at all, no fooling, and that they're still planning to make a bunch of unannounced visits to see what's really authentically going on. Final thought, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown, and this is another of those stories which can be very easily explained. Now, if you know anything about Minnesota, you know that from time to time things get a bit chilly in the land of a bunch of lakes and ponds and such, and therefore, to ensure that he didn't catch a draft, Governor Walz Cakes must have thrown a wool blanket over his head to keep warm and cozy and toasty. Now, as you might imagine, blankets are kind of like sand. And when you bury your head in either, you can't always see everything that's happening all around you. Therefore, it may be the case that a few dollars here and a couple of bucks there may have gone to a group of individuals who, just like Timbo, are mildly fond of blankets made out of wool, and they sort of kind of pulled the wool over everyone's eyes. And here's the deal. Running a state, it's a bit like running a business. And while this never happens at Amazon or Microsoft or Starbucks or really any well-run outfit, maybe that was a bad example. I got to rethink that one. Therefore, in closing, I say this Tim Walz fella is doing a bang-up job. And while the state which he manages brilliantly is being investigated for $9 billion worth of fraud, I hereby proclaim that when he runs for re-election, I think he deserves another term in office. And I'm sure he'll try harder next time to rein in the fraud, the corruption, and more. And all on his watch, on account of this guy, Tim, he's a stand-up guy. Also, once again, I apologize in advance for any interruptions during today's program, but at any moment, Governor Walz may be calling in on this hotline right here to thank me for defending him. And if he does, so you know, I will be taking that call. We'll stick with a bit of a related topic and shift our focus to a congressional lawmaker who says that what's going on right now in Minnesota, that's small potatoes compared to the colossal fraud which is currently taking place in California. A Republican representative named Kevin Kiley, never heard of that guy, but he claims that in the Golden State, the woeful mismanagement of that smiling fella right there, Governor Gavin Newsom, and his Democratic cronies is now far worse than what's happening in the North Star State, if you can believe that. And he's pointing to a recent state audit as proof in the pudding. Rice pudding, the worst pudding on the planet, California rice pudding. The congressman says that according to California's nonpartisan auditor, a number of critical state agencies now officially considered to be high risk because they're currently full of fraud, abuse, and waste. Also placing the blame squarely on Governor Newsom, gruesome Newsom, whom he says is responsible for allowing the number of vulnerable agencies in the state to double under his watch, and all while leaving taxpayers on the hook for billions of dollars, which will eventually be needed to fix the problem. Additionally, the lawmaker points to several of Newsom's high-profile boondoggles, including a failed high-speed rail project, I heard about that one, a squandered homeless initiative, and massive unemployment insurance fraud, all of which resulted in billions of taxpayer dollars going right down the drain without accomplishing anything useful whatsoever. According to the audit, California's highly vulnerable agencies now include the state's entire Department of Social Services, as well as specific programs dealing with federally funded SNAP food assistance, Medi-Cal eligibility, employment development, and more. And as the congressman says, the list just goes on and on and on. Final thought, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown. Here's the bottom line. As a lifelong Californian myself, I say proudly, anything Minnesota does, we can do better. More fraud, more widespread, more hard-earned tax dollars wasted, more hard-working taxpayers impacted. Epic failure after epic failure, unmatched epic failure. In your face, Minnesota. Here in the Golden State, we always say go big or go home. Now, before people begin to attack California's governor, the Honorable Gavin Newsom, let's break this down for you. Yeah, perhaps the state has spent $18 billion on a high-speed rail without really building any track at all. Yeah, easy. Are there no airplanes? Are there no cars and trucks to move about town? Can you not call Greyhound and maybe leave the driving to them? And this one, the state reportedly shelled out $24 billion on homelessness. Yeah, the state lost track of the money. Well, look, have you ever lost anything? Car keys, maybe your wallet, cell phone, things like that happen. Also, because we are short on time, we'll pay very little attention today to the reported $32 billion lost to the unemployment insurance fraud scam. So in the interest of fairness, maybe the money was simply misplaced and not exactly lost. Kind of a semantic debate, I suppose. In any event, a big news roundup, pat on the back, and away to go to Governor Gavin Newsom for a job well done. And remember that name, Gavin Newsom, in 2028, when he runs for president on the platform, I'll do for the country what I did for California. Or I'll do to the country what I did to California. That's one of those two. Now, a couple of additional headlines and stories we're keeping a very close watch on here in the News Roundup newsroom. And first, a new federal report revealing that during the former Biden administration, billions of dollars in taxpayer funds, my money and your money, used to provide housing assistance for tens of thousands of renters who were already dead. The The same report showing that the former president's team also provided rental aid to a number of potential non-citizens as well. How does that happen? And moving right along, authorities in Texas arresting a trio of illegal immigrants from Eastern Europe and charging them all for their roles in a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme dealing with hundreds of stolen and reprogrammed gift cards. Kind of feels like everybody is pretty much just kind of scamming everybody and everywhere all the time. And breaking developments from the Pacific, where the Chinese Communist regime is now firing rockets and carrying out a number of long-range live-fire military drills around Taiwan. Those aggressive and belligerent moves coming as part of a days-long show of force, which China says is designed to send a very loud message to any country that wants to keep them from reuniting with their island neighbor. And by the way, just so you know, the Trump administration, they've got Taiwan's back. And now a quick gander at a bit of rock and roll showbiz news, and we kick things off today with a remarkable accomplishment for a world-famous musician who's just joined a very exclusive club. Following a stellar recent run, 44-year-old Beyonce Knowles Carter, a very lovely young lady, now officially a billionaire, becoming only the fifth musician to ever hold the elite distinction. The performer, now a proud member of musical royalty, which includes Bruce Springsteen, also Taylor Swift, Rihanna as well, and her own hubby, Jay-Z. So if he has $1 billion and she has $1 billion, wouldn't they kind of be multi-billionaires? And I suppose being a billionaire was her destiny, or her density. It was one of those two. Yeah, she's the real deal. She got the goods, always hits all the right notes, and she's one of those big-time Hollywood movie stars. And you saw her on the big screen with Mike Myers in the 2002 comedy Austin Powers in Goldmember. That's where she played the character Foxy Cleopatra, typecast as, well, kind of foxy. She's easy on the eyes. And speaking of musicians, another legendary rocker now apparently so desperate to get rid of his house that he's dropping the asking price by $1 million. Editor Pranav the Magnificent. Do we have a shot of that house? Kiss leader Gene Simmons putting his palatial Beverly Hills estate back on the market, listing it this time around for an asking price of just under $13 million. Hey, like Gene Simmons and the band says, give us a kiss. Here's the deal. Life just keeps getting better and better. Your chance right now to live like a rock star in a gorgeous mansion with incredible views. And if you act now, he'll knock $1 million off the price tag. They don't do that at car dealerships or furniture stores or fancy restaurants. And this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Also, what's your favorite Kiss song? Leave us a comment if you would. I'm just kind of curious. And mine was always Beth, a rockin' good ballad. All right, turning now to a former Hollywood child star whose career it was so successful allowed him to retire at the ripe young age of 14. Macaulay Culkin says that ever since he hit big as the star of Home Alone and Richie Rich, he's never had to work another day in his life. And in the meantime, also says he's sick and tired of fans approaching him in public and kind of following him around whenever he's out with the family, adding that if you ever happen to run into him in person, he'd prefer it if you just kind of back off, leave him alone, respect his privacy, and all the rest.
I didn't want to see you again for the rest of my whole life, and I didn't want to see anybody else either.
You know, Big Mac may be rich and famous, but he's also sort of kind of dumb as well. He just told the whole world what they should not do if they happen to cross his path, which is great. So now every knucklehead with a story to sell to TMZ is going to do all those goofback things because there's a payday involved. We're all fans of the guy, the Home Alone kid, but you know, he's actually tons better in that 1993 picture, The Good Son. And we'll see if editor Pranav the Magnificent might have a clip for us.
He's thinking about the end. He's had enough of this terrible life. What? Say goodbye. No!
Like the ad said, evil has many faces. That was his best picture. And now it is time for us to call it a wrap on the big news roundups. Have an awesome day today. Stay safe. If you haven't done so already, it's not a big deal. Just hit that subscribe button right over there. With that, we're going to dim the lights and we'll fade to black. And we'll see you right back here tomorrow for a brand new edition of the Big News Roundup.